My name is Robert Lord. This is a bad breakup story. Everybody's got one, right? I first saw Fiona standing silhouetted against a hospital window, a midline IV in her right arm. I couldn't even really see her face in that first passing glimpse. I think now how curious it was that I felt the compulsion to stop at her door for a longer look and to offer a few simple words. She was not my patient. Our conversation was natural, and she was flirtatious from the beginning, completely comfortable with me seeing her with no makeup, her long blonde hair in unwashed tangles, the profusion of tattoos on her body jarring so greatly with that cheap, pale blue gown. We talked about her miraculous survival of the fate that had come for her on the 12th of June. We couldn't talk long. I had a lot of consulting to do that day in radiology. She was released 4 days later, and we began to see each other right away, she still hobbling on crutches. At 2 a.m, on our first night together away, at a bed and breakfast in Cobden, she told me in some detail about the unusual activities that occupied her at night, and had since she was a teenager. She could have lied to me for months if she'd really tried, I suppose, explaining away her strange hours and secretive outings with friends I never met. But she chose to partially let me in. Why didn't I run then, when she revealed her perplexing interests? You know why. It was because of the all-consuming fog of physical and emotional infatuation, that yearning to chase an unexpected adventure into something completely divergent. It was because of the way eroticism erodes what is logical and redefines what we believe we need from moment to moment. In a way, I was secretly thrilled that Fiona was so bizarre. After a lifetime of playing it so safe, I had been set free into some dizzying maze. Get good grades, go to school, become a doctor. Yes, Mom and Dad. Come back from California to Illinois to practice, and be close to your brothers and sisters. Yes, I will. I will. Fiona broke all of that. She was beautiful entropy. In the last years, I felt I had to reach out for it. At 44, I'd begun to fear I would never experience the rush of making reckless decisions whose consequences were unknowable. I was excited to tell my few friends about her. Really? She believes what? They said. Are you kidding? What do they do when they get together? Do they ever hurt anyone? I'm not sure about any of it, I would say. Fiona filled my head with talk of enlightened ancient religions and elaborated on New Age concepts I could barely grasp. But it was all foreign to me in the same way my ex-wife's love for mathematics had been. I described Fiona to others in as much detail as I had been allowed by her to stitch together. And then I would swipe through my phone to bring up her photograph to complete the biography. That photograph of her posing seductively at the Sarah Brightman concert, just so. But my craving for her was about more than that. Her mind was always in exploration mode, hungry to know the meaning and origin of every new word she heard, fascinated by old buildings and dying towns. Her wit was extremely dark, and her judgments of others were quick and decisive and rarely flattering. She refused to talk about politics or current affairs, and I soon began to see that human beings were necessary obstacles to her ideal life among animals and plants, and perhaps one other soul who could accept her for what she described herself to be. Her life had not been an easy journey, not since she was 12 and had fled from her adoptive parents. She would turn 42 that autumn, decades of territory for our conversations to cover, a whole lifetime to explore. Sometimes the details didn't seem to jibe with others. Sometimes names seemed to change and chronologies were inconsistent. As a freelance graphic designer, she had called 7 cities home in the last 9 years. If I ever felt the urge to question her more deeply about what I suspected were white lies, the urges were often buried in anticipation of the next intense kiss, the next gaze at and touch of all the unusual art inked into her skin over time, the next compelling insight on the uglier side of human psychology. She perceived a slow-growing but tidal evil embedded in humankind, which she knew in her heart made peace on earth impossible, apocalypse a certainty. One night, 5 weeks into our relationship, I woke up in my house in DeSoto and she wasn't there beside me. I assumed she'd gone off somewhere, as usual, without saying goodbye, uncontainable even in the night's deadest hours, gone out in pursuit of her eccentric and mystifying way. But she was downstairs in the living room. Someone who'd been inside the elementary school gymnasium the afternoon a historically violent storm had struck the town of Sparta had just posted the video they'd taken there. Only 8 locals had sought safety in that hastily organized shelter that day, but then the winds had shifted in a way that defied natural logic, and at the moment a tornado bore down on the building. A dozen more people were running toward it, only to cower in their tracks when they realized what was happening. Fiona was watching the video on my big screen TV, in the dark, at no point realizing I was even there. She was entranced. The video is still out there to this day. It's 49 seconds long, a single, unsteady, wandering shot taken from a cell phone. It sounds like some kind of enormous industrial machine has wrapped itself around the building, a machine that thrums and threatens, creating distortion in the phone's tiny microphone. You hear a man hollering at his wife to press herself against a wall. In the semi-darkness, a basketball hoop is shaken, and one violent quiver of the camera lens catches sight of a small broken window high up near the ceiling. Through it, curls of wind have invaded the gym. 2 banners commemorating the 50th anniversary of the school's founding are billowing on the ceiling. And then a thin woman with blonde hair is seen running toward the tall doors that separate the people inside the building from the shrieking havoc that has come for this small town in southwestern Illinois. Fiona flings her body against the horizontal metal bar which will release her, as if she knows it will take all her weight to get out. An old man screams at her to stop. The door opens only halfway, and then the wind invades, tries to batter it back. That wind is so loud that all the foreground noise is simply swallowed in a terrible exhalation of an unseen monster's breath. What can be glimpsed of the outdoors is a blur of gray, boiled in a torrent of motion, and Fiona runs into it, her hair wrapping itself around her face. The woman operating the cell phone camera runs frantically in the opposite direction then, losing sight of everything. But not before Fiona is seen at the edge of the frame, throwing her arms up instinctively to protect her eyes as she stumbles forward into an abyss that few have ever escaped from. When the video ended that night in my living room, she just sat there, as another vacuous trifle depicting disaster and panic queued up on some anonymous user's playlist. She'd suffered 6 broken bones and a concussion, but the deep cut into the medial patellar of her left leg had been the true emergency. She'd lost a stunning amount of blood. They'd choppered her to Carbondale after finding her in a church parking lot a mile from the school. That moment when she couldn't seem to drag her eyes from the screen to perceive my presence was when I first felt logical considerations return to me, and I saw her for what she might be, a mechanism of ruination that could never be settled by someone with my docile temperament. "Why did you run into it?" I asked her. "You never told me that." "Were you really in Sparta that day to talk to a design client?" She finally confessed to a few untruths. To the question of whether there was something she had felt or sensed that day that told her to go to that place of all places at that particular time, she was evasive. The important thing, she tried to explain, was that she had gotten what she wanted from the encounter, had seized it before it could slip away from her. It was not suicide, she said. She asked me to hold her. That became something much more, as if she were trying to smother that ugly moment by creating a memory of exhausting intimacy. She got me to promise I would wait a while to make her tell me more about the incident. I did stay with her, all along preparing myself for the difficult conversation I knew was likely ahead. I was going to fail, that much was clear. It was only a matter of time before the safe and comforting handcuffs of my daily reality drew me back from Fiona and the mystery of her desires. That was the prudent, prosaic way I'd always lived. Then came those 5 days in August. I was used to her temporary disappearances, 1, 2, and even 3 days without any sort of contact. But this time, on day 4, I couldn't take it anymore. Late on a Sunday night, I drove downtown to her tawdry little walk-up over a yarn shop and climbed a dreary stairwell where someone had graffitied the words "Screw Democracy" in orange letters 8 inches high. When there was no answer to my knocks at Fiona's door, I decided with a mix of worry and anger that I was getting in there somehow. I told myself I was concerned for her safety, that she could be missing or in danger, but I truly think I'd simply reached the end of my frustration with her secrecy. The old credit card trick worked just fine on her cheap lock. I'd only visited her there twice. The place was dark and cramped, and she confined the entirety of her actual living space to the main room, where a futon had become her permanent bed. No TV, just books upon books, and a laptop tucked away somewhere so she could work. Immediately I was gifted with an unusual stroke of luck. In the kitchen, a sheet of paper with handwritten travel directions to some unidentified place about 20 miles away was fastened to the refrigerator. They had no context whatsoever and no addresses listed, but I took a photograph of them all the same because of a date written below them. August 14th. With a question mark. That was 4 days before. What was supposed to be the bedroom had been emptied out and made into a place where she stored the things she didn't care to talk about. I'd never actually been in there before. That was where I went next. A lamp sitting on the floor had been left on in there, providing a somber glow. I should have left then. There was somehow more a sense of trespassing looking at all the uncanny objects she kept than even if I had read her diary. To an outsider, none of them made sense. A dozen or more jars sat along the top of a bookshelf, each one marked with a sticker bearing a unique 2-letter code written by hand. ZNEKLLPV. There was a thin liquid in each, of a pinkish color that varied in intensity from jar to jar. A number of old audio cassettes were jumbled in a small novelty picnic basket on the windowsill, and a battery-operated tape player rested on the floor beneath it. The labels on the cassettes bore hastily scrawled phrases. Starfish Farm 1, Starfish Farm 2, Starfish Farm 3, and so on. Uncomfortable with the silence, I knelt to put one of the cassettes into the player and started it, continuing my exploration as tape hiss filled the room. The recording began with the faint sound of dozens of footsteps belonging to many people filing into some unknown room with a creaky wooden floor. Chairs were moved around and taken as people settled wordlessly. Laying on a card table behind me was a gold sword, about 4 feet in length, vintage, caked in rust, valuable, maybe. There was a thick, vivid, muddy handprint on the handle. I touched my index finger to that substance, which inexplicably was very, very cold. Paranoid, I turned to the doorway, looked out into the other room. Someone had to have been in here recently. On the cassette tape, a woman had begun to speak in French to her audience in that small room at something called Starfish Farm. I stepped into the tiny bathroom to run some water over my finger. The overhead bulb had burned out. The archaic tap in there spat out a burst of loud air before delivering a weak stream. I dried my hand on a towel, and when I looked back into the sink, the substance I'd washed off my fingers had left a curious stain there, an almost perfect gray. In the bedroom, the woman speaking French had, for some reason, become angry, and her words were sharp and urgent, creating an echo. Before I left the bathroom, something caught my eye in the mirror over the sink. The shower curtain had been drawn back from the tub, and there was a large black zipper bag in it, taking up almost its entirety. I knelt to look at it, pressing a hand down onto its center. Something was definitely inside, a broken accumulation of material that stretched about 5 feet. I pressed my hand down more firmly and moved it slowly toward one end. A light bundle of petrified wood is what I first thought. I felt something vaguely round and hard beneath the zipper's tongue. I pushed my index finger into some kind of small, circular indentation, and I immediately thought it could be only one thing, which was an eye socket. I left the bathroom in one swift motion, revolted, and stopped the tape as the Frenchwoman's voice rose in either defiance or accusation, and she began to laugh in a cynical way, as others in the room laughed with her. I rewound the tape, put it back in the basket, and left the apartment. After about 2 hours of sleep, I dragged myself into the hospital before dawn to prepare for a lecture on venipuncture I had to give at 10, leaving the rest of the day free to drive where the instructions I'd found in the apartment indicated. Having no idea who to call about Fiona, I had no other useful inspiration. I had an unexpected guest in my office, one who had just walked right in, knowing I would be there at some point that morning. She'd been prepared to wait as long as it took to greet me. Fiona sat in the visitor's chair across from my desk. She wore an oversized brown sweater and sweatpants, having no jacket despite the daybreak chill outside. She looked pale and hungry. There was no embrace of reunion, no wry smile for me. She didn't even stand up. She was a shell of herself. I didn't know what to say when I sat down on the other side of the desk from her. I really just wanted to know if she was all right, because she certainly didn't look it. It was hard to believe this was the same woman who'd walked with me 2 weeks before beside Cedar Lake, wearing a dark blue sundress, tilting her face to the sun. She was afraid to tell me where she'd been, only that it was what she called another necessary step in a sequence. Toward what? I asked. That was when she spoke the word transformation for the first time. Not enlightenment or education. Transformation. A very, very different word. She was back for a while now, and she hoped to have her energy back in a few days, at which time she would be able to say more. She refused my assertive offer of even a cursory physical examination. I confessed to breaking into her apartment, and I told her flat out that this was not the life for me, not one I felt comfortable with anymore. That we were way too different to make away with each other. How do I describe the burning silence that followed my clumsy little speech? For a moment it was as if she hadn't heard me at all. And then on her face grew an expression that had no precedent in either our brief relationship or in my life. Her head tilted like a dog's that was confused by its keeper's wishes, and her eyes went utterly dead, then widened, a precursor to physical attack. I felt the hair on my arms tingle, and my breathing actually stopped for a second. "Do you know how far I've walked?" she said. "Do you want to see my feet?" I apologized, told her I needed to focus on my work, and that it was best if we didn't contact each other anymore. Fiona rose very slowly from her chair. She took one step toward my desk. She whispered, "One day, I'll walk on a carpet of the dead." She seemed to tower above me. Fiona's eyes began to roll backward in their sockets. Just as I began to stand to help her, that horrible sight corrected itself and passed so quickly I could almost have imagined it. And then she stared at me as before, ruthless but pitying somehow, a superior creature only briefly thrown by a puny one. I was terrified of her then. But she turned and moved very slowly out of the office like an etherized patient. She did not look back. I remember her turning right, which would have led into the corridor directing people toward radiology and the chapel. I got up, closed my door, and for the first time ever locked it. When my receptionist came in a half hour later, I instructed her not to let anyone in to see me that day without first calling my desk to confirm it. A few minutes later, I noticed that Fiona had left some dirt on the floor, both entering and leaving. In fact, I thought, but could not prove, that I'd seen a small clump of it fall from her hair as she spoke. Driven half mad by curiosity, I drove 21 miles south after my lecture, following the directions I'd photographed in Fiona's apartment. The handwriting that had made them was distinctly feminine, but not Fiona's own. Their level of detail clearly did not come from some cursory search of the internet. I found myself entering Trail of Tears State Forest and parking in one of its many sequestered lots. Find Cherry Road and take the Blue Heron Trail to the south, past the duck pond, the directions said. I'd stopped to buy bottled water because Blue Heron Trail wound through the woods for miles toward Brown Barrens Nature Preserve. Halfway through my solitary hike, after passing only about a dozen other people, I veered off the trail, just as I should have. I tramped through modest underbrush for 15 minutes, slowly gaining elevation and spotting a giant rock formation shaped like a U, which served as another key landmark. I'd come to feel isolated and uneasy, feeling that no resolution to these directions could make any sense. Finally, up ahead I saw a rocky area beside a dry creek bed, apparently the last step on the list. I'd been led to the middle of nowhere. It was well beyond the creek bed that I found a grassless patch where there had been excavated a crude ditch about 6 feet long and 4 feet deep. Some of the dirt that had been removed to create it lay in small piles on the ditch's edge, great chunks of cool, wet earth. But most of it remained in the ditch, loose and broken. If it was a grave I was looking at, it created one very odd impression, that its occupant had, sometime in the last few days most likely, dragged themselves out of it from one end. After returning to the hospital for some bleary-eyed consultations, I slogged home at 11 at night, mentally exhausted more so than physically. As I went around turning on lights and making myself a sandwich, I developed a persistently paranoid feeling. I thought about my large, empty basement and how it sat in darkness night after night, so many places to hide. I thought about the spare bedroom and how I hadn't opened the door and looked inside it for at least a week. How long I had lived alone and not given a moment's consideration to how easily accessible the backyard was from the woods. When there was a knock at my front door, I almost knocked over my glass of iced tea. It was 11:31. I approached the door as quietly as I could and peered through the peephole. There was a woman with dark gray hair out there, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Something about the way she was dressed, mostly in black, told me I needed to speak to her. She introduced herself as Greta Fair and informed me she had practiced with Fiona for 12 years. There was no apology for the late hour. She had to tell me something, she said, quietly and calmly. The right side of her head was shaved, and the silver pendant which hung from her neck described the shape of a hawk. Like anyone else Fiona had ever associated with, I'd never met her before. Her eyes seemed very small, very dark. She looked to be about 60. Fiona had given her my address a week after she'd started seeing me, Greta explained when I asked how she'd come to have it. Fiona had done this for her own protection. Greta had no designs to engage in small talk, and I ended even the possibility by asking her what Fiona was trying to do, if she were slowly trying to kill herself. That would probably be the result, I was told, but it was not Fiona's intention. I wanted to know about the forest next. My suspicions about what lay out there were quickly confirmed. Fiona had coerced Greta into assisting her in her own burial, though the nature of this coercion was not revealed. Fiona had lain alive and virtually motionless in that grave for 82 hours, before Greta had returned at a prearranged time to pull her out, driving her directly to a hospital in Jonesboro for an aborted treatment for pneumonia and dehydration. "You have to go somewhere far away," Greta told me when I took too long to think of another line of questioning. "You have to separate yourself from her very, very delicately." Fiona, she explained, was becoming too powerful. She'd been holding a book in one hand all along, and I had never even noticed it. Now she held it out to me. Thin, dark brown, its cover and spine unmarked. I was instructed to take it, protect it from harm, and neither show nor mention it to anyone else until she returned for it. She claimed this was all she could say to me. I explained in some detail what had happened that morning with Fiona, that I'd told her we were through, and that I doubted I'd see her again, ever. "This is the worst possible thing you could have done," she said softly, as if she were in awe of how stupid I'd been. Did I know that Fiona had been abused, and that there had been a pattern of it for 3 decades? I assured her I did know that. But did I know how she had dealt with some of her abusers? Did I know that the forces she had bound herself to in the spring in order to start down this path wouldn't have allowed her to do it unless she'd already laid it with some of them? "It's her anger," Greta said, "that created her desire to transform. Even if she were to win all her gambles and become something beyond biology, she would never rise above jealousy, rage, revenge. People like me Fiona called us the takers and the abandoners. You've made her weak all her life, Greta said coldly. This was insane. I hadn't done anything wrong. I fell for someone. I fell. We use that word for a reason. But in Greta's mind, if I had tried to tell Fiona it was over, the only hope I had to escape the situation was if she miscalculated the next risk she took. She'd taken 2, and now only had 2 more to go. Frustrated, I impotently held the book back out to her, telling her I didn't want to read some text to explain what was going on. I wanted her to explain things. But before I even got this thought out of my mouth, Greta's eyes shifted over my left shoulder and into the house, and she cut me off. She's here right now, Greta said under her breath. It was half statement and half question, as if a sixth sense had overcome her. Clearly she was very afraid. I turned and looked back through the shadowy living room, where I'd just turned all the lights out in preparation for bed. The air in the house felt different, even more possessed by an unseen presence than when I had walked in 45 minutes before. But I didn't know how much of that was stress and an ever more riled imagination. I took a few steps toward the room, peering beyond it into the kitchen, where the refrigerator in that moment cycled on again, humming faintly. I heard Greta move, and I turned back to the front door. She was walking down my driveway toward the quiet road, fading into darkness as she moved beyond the security floodlights' reach. Somehow she'd gotten out here without a car unless she'd parked it far away. I stopped myself from calling out to her and just let her go. After a thorough exploration of the house to ease my mind, and several minutes spent observing the shadow-dense edge of my back lawn from an upper window, convinced I'd seen something move out there on the border of the woods, I sat down at the kitchen table with Greta's book. It was quite old and rough-textured. The binding was barely hanging together. I opened to the title page. There were only 3 large words printed there, in a language I was completely unfamiliar with. 2 of the letters weren't even recognizable as anything I'd ever seen. I turned the tanned pages carefully, estimating the book's age to be 75, 100 years. The writing within was in that same language, speckled occasionally with more unusual letters, rendered in a serif font that reminded me of old newspapers. The more I looked at the text, the more I became convinced I was looking at English, but in a kind of code. Nothing in the front or the back of the book hinted at any kind of key I might use to decipher it, but I soon believed Greta felt the pictures would tell the story. There were 12 drawings in all, spread throughout, all done in black ink, quite skilled. Most of them depicted gatherings of women. One showed several of them dressed in flowing robes, moving through some sort of low, dark tunnel, lit by torches they carried. Another showed a beach at night, with 3 women standing at the tide line, facing the ocean. There was a burning ship on the horizon, some sort of war galley by the looks of it. Another drawing showed an enormous but almost entirely featureless house on an empty plain beneath a completely black sky, and in each window was a feminine face in an unlit room, though none of the women had mouths. They all gazed off the page with sunken eyes. Toward the end of the book came the pictures I felt I most understood. They were of a different artistic style, unrelated to the others, and in these there was always just one woman depicted. She was bald and unclothed. Her face was never clearly shown. Here she was in an open field, distorted and stretched to suggest her bowing in the face of a violent onrush of wind. Long pen slashes depicted downed trees laying all around her, and tall grasses were being pulled toward the bottom of the page by the gale. The gray sky above her roiled with ambiguous shapes. 2 pages after that, she was gazing up from the bottom of a deep, deep cave. A tiny circle of sky high above her, through which the stars could be seen. The interior of the cave was contoured with jagged rocks and barbed arches, and she was compacted into it, having no room on either side of her to even move. After that, she was hanging upside down by a long length of rope, which stretched up and out of frame, her feet and arms bound. She was underwater, and in the background some sort of giant, shadowy, two-tailed monster was lurking, swimming behind her. This sequence of drawings, if that's indeed what it was, ended with the woman lying in a desert. Again, it was night, but there was almost nothing left of her. Her body was blackened, her face finally exposed, but rendered only as an indistinct mass. Yet her left arm was raised toward the stars in some inscrutable gesture of defiance. Around her crouched wolves, staring obediently at her with pinprick eyes that glowed from the light of a burning wooden post, from which, I assume, she'd just been set free, perhaps gnawed free. Below each of these 4 sketches was printed a single word, finally in a recognizable language now, French. Even from my limited memory of studying the language in college, I could determine these were the words for each of the 4 natural elements that comprised our world.
Air, earth, water, fire.
10 pages from the back cover had been etched an image I could only bear to look at for 5 seconds, no more. And then that awful book absolutely had to be closed for good. It showed a midnight plain, identical to the one where that strange house had been drawn. But now the house was gone. An enormous human figure was walking from over the horizon, toward the reader's eye. Small trees and a distant road meant to show scale had the effect of making the figure seem 100 feet tall. Her hands were claws, her arms muscular. Long, ragged hair curtained her face. On that face was an expression of such malevolence. It felt like it would emerge from the page to kill me if I looked too long. The giant's eyes were milky, her corneas misshapen and dripping from the corners with some black substance. The ground beneath her feet was strewn in all directions with tiny human bodies, every one of them crushed, the level of detail ghastly. Legs, arms, and heads had been separated from bodies, so many of them that the earth itself could not be seen. Instead of a single word, the French caption below this last drawing was comprised of a full sentence. With some work and some conjecture, I was able to translate it online.
The wagerer, if able to taste victory over death 4 times, will be granted the promised transformation, and she will become unnameable.
September 13. It had been 3 weeks since I'd seen or heard from Fiona. An email from an airline had reminded me of a vacation I'd set up long in advance. A vacation designed to please Fiona, to bring her memories of a beach trip she'd been invited on once with a childhood playmate, before those years had suddenly become frightening for her. She'd been excited to go. I was depressed and lonely. I decided to go on the trip myself, to seclude myself on Cape Cod, among autumn scenery and slow sunsets. I boarded a plane to Boston and landed at 9 p.m., then drove a rental car to a hotel in Falmouth. I walked the next morning to the 10 a.m. ferry to Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard, planning to spend the day walking slowly to Chilmark, as I'd done a few times before. The sky was muddy with storm clouds, and I was worried that the trip would be canceled and I'd have to drive to the bigger boat in Woods Hole. But the woman in the ticket window said they'd gotten no formal indication of a real problem. We set out on the half-hour ride in choppy waters and gusty winds, and more than a few of the 100 or so passengers looked queasy. I sat on the lower deck and tried to read a collection of travelogues as the boat thumped and struggled with the waves. About 15 minutes in, the captain made an announcement that regretfully we would have to turn back. He'd just been radioed that a front was moving quickly toward Nantucket Sound, and it would be too dangerous to go on. Groans of irritation and disappointment throughout the boat. The snack bar was quickly shut down, and the 2 college kids working it turned their attentions instead to urging people to find a seat wherever they could, as the wide turn in the direction of the mainland would briefly rock the ferry even more. I was sitting next to 2 Indian children, who had cajoled their humorless father into filling their hands with snacks from the moment we'd set out. Now they were pointing over the side of the boat at the sky, and the little girl needed to be soothed. I looked in that direction. Yes, rather alarming thunderheads had rolled in, and the wind had picked up noticeably. I was sitting near a railing, and would be unable there to evade an oncoming downpour, so I moved quickly to the stanchion nearest the snack bar to stand and brace myself. 3 other pairs of hands were already on it. The boat began a long, jagged curl, which, according to a man struggling to stand behind me, revealed a disturbing lack of skill on the part of whoever was at the wheel. I made eye contact with an elderly woman in a green scarf that flowed down to her knees. She had one hand to her head as if she were warding off a migraine, and she stared hard and cold at the floor while her husband glanced around nervously. The rain came. While there was still plenty of standing room along the sides of the wide stairwell that led to the top deck, I went there, positioning myself on the bottom step and holding on to the stout railing as people above began to file down very carefully, crowding the lower deck. The jostling of the boat was worse than expected. Drinks were spilled, children were grabbed and pulled back to their fretting mothers. A young guy with a huge backpack and a long beard went preemptively down on one knee, expecting worse to come. Water came over the railing for the first time, coating the deck with foaming droplets as the last of the more adventurous passengers retreated from the edges of the boat. It began to rise and fall upon the waves in a way I hadn't experienced since going on a drunken charter once in Florida, gaining a disturbing amount of elevation with each swell. Now the captain's messages over the PA were both constant and unintelligible, dwarfed by distressed conversation, the battering of the waves, and the groaning of the engine. I offered a limp smile to a little girl looking quizzically around her as her grandfather zipped up her pink windbreaker. Someone bumped my shoulder hard coming down the stairs, and I looked up toward the top deck, surprised that not everyone had come down already. I recognized a face up there, framed by the gray, darkening daylight. It was Fiona's. She was looking directly at me. It couldn't be. She could not be here. But it took only a split second's conscious thought to realize that it certainly was possible. Passengers filed past her in a hurry, many of them getting soaked. The rain slanted in and struck Fiona's back and the side of her face, speckling her blouse. Her eyes were fixed on mine. I began to move up the stairs with difficulty, maneuvering between bodies coming fast in the other direction, losing sight of her briefly. A man struggling to put on a cheap plastic parka even as he came down got careless with his arms and struck me in the neck painfully. He apologized dismissively and kept moving, and when I regained my balance, Fiona wasn't there anymore. By the time I'd reached the top of the stairs, lights had come on all over the boat, and the wind was whipping over the railings. There came a sound I'd never heard before, a wet hissing as swirling layers of spray rising off the waves surrounded the boat, and it became difficult to keep my eyes open. A man in an eye patch blocked my way, seizing me by the shoulders, yelling at me to go back down, and then he slipped on the deck, falling hard. I looked around me at all the empty rows of orange plastic seats and saw Fiona sitting alone, facing away from me now, facing the front of the boat. Looking out over the water, I couldn't see land and I couldn't see the sound. It was all undefinable. I was soaking wet in an instant. The man in the eye patch was struggling to get up and I helped him. A woman screamed down below. There was the bleating of a horn that went on, swallowed bit by the hissing of the attacking spray. Then the boat, which had finally managed to set a proper course back toward Falmouth, rose once again and suddenly shook violently. I found myself tumbling down the steps, a bolt of pain shooting through my hip, grabbing hold of the railing before I could descend almost halfway. I heard a thunderous cracking sound, followed by a dog yelping, and the entire world began to tilt. I remember getting both hands on the railing and seeing my legs dangling in the air. I held on for as long as I could, but my hands on the rail were too slippery, and I fell. They would tell me later that only 90 seconds passed between that moment and the one when 24 passengers went into the sound, which means that much of the imagery that skittered and danced through my mind as I lay unconscious in the hospital afterwards was of my own tortured invention. There was simply too much of it to have ever truly happened. I remember seeing a folded wheelchair fly by me and over a railing, striking it so hard that one of the wheels came off. I remember a door opening and a man tumbling out of it, and seeing a toilet tank behind him. He'd been cowering inside the men's room, grasping the doorknob, and gravity had flung him out. I saw dozens of silver quarters sliding and bouncing down the lower deck when the angle of the boat stopped making sense. I saw a man running with a life jacket in each hand, his path cut short when he collided with a bike rack he had no idea was there because the lights had suddenly gone out again, and everything had gotten unnaturally dark. Where there had been daylight, there was instead a wall of black water, its surface scarred by rotating eddies of mist. And then I was submerged. Down into the water after me came a child with dark skin. I saw his small hand clutching a bag of Skittles before he was swept away. The upper half of my body twisted and spun, and I felt my right shoe yanked off my foot. I was sucked into a dark funnel. Arms pulled high and all sound suddenly stopped. I was twisting and spiraling downwards. I was nothing but a bare ounce of fading consciousness. Then I felt fingers around my throat, squeezing, and my eyes came open. Fiona's face was in front of mine in the frigid deep. Her eyes large, her mouth open in a scream not of anger but of primal, naked terror. That was when an immense, shapeless shadow slammed down like a giant fist from above the surface of the water, creating a resounding, ear-splitting echo. The tide which had pulled me down sucked me back upwards again, free of Fiona's death grip, and I tasted freezing air. A wave carried me to an impossible height and at high speed toward the exposed, rusting underside of the ferry. I threw my hands up and outward to save myself, and then the hissing mist enfolded me. My return to Carbondale and my life at the hospital 3.5 weeks later was a quiet one. I was walking again by then, with a limp that was aggravating but manageable, and my right hand wouldn't close all the way and might not do so for a very long time. I got devastating headaches every 4 days or so, the lingering effect of a concussion that was very nearly much more than that. In the water, I'd struck my head hard on an unknown object, which one doctor theorized, based on my fragmented memories, may have been another's skull. On my first day back, I was taken to lunch by my colleagues. and given a get-well card everyone had signed, and was then left blessedly alone. I was unable to stop myself from my daily check of the rapidly forgotten news story of the Oak Bluffs ferry. 4 people had drowned, and everyone else seemed to be accounted for, though that couldn't be determined for certain. No walk-up passengers had been asked to show ID to buy a ticket for the crossing. I used what influence I had to search other hospitals on Cape Cod for evidence someone with Fiona's description had been brought in. Even if she gave a fake name, I figured all her body art would likely jostle a memory or two. But no. I spent my nights at home, gritting my teeth through the physical therapy exercises I'd been given, catching up on medical journals, and mastering my new home security system. On Sunday, October 16th, the very last day of this story, I was visited by the police at a little past 1:30 p.m. They were 2 very cordial detectives who had enough of a sense of humor to introduce themselves as the 2 Pats, 1 man, 1 woman. They'd come to ask me what my relationship had been to Fiona Ruth Plowser, age 42, current whereabouts unknown. There had been an incident at her last known address downtown. The 2 Pats were in my home for a total of an hour, during which time I told them about 2/3 of the truth, fearful of the rabbit hole the entire story might swallow me up in. Fiona's neighbors had heard 3 gunshots at about 11:30 p.m. on the 12th. Police had arrived at West College Street to find her apartment door open and the residence itself empty. The sheets on her futon bed had been kicked or pulled off, and 2 of those gunshots had struck the futon itself, while the 3rd had put a 20-gauge bullet deep into the wall behind it. The window had been wide open, and it was conceivable that if Fiona had been in there, she'd gotten out onto the fire escape. Because no one had come forward to express concern for her whereabouts, only a few fruitless calls had been made to some phone numbers that had been found in her apartment. My own number had been called multiple times from a cell phone she left behind, but the most recent call had been in August. There was no mention of or questioning about Fiona's beliefs or lifestyle, or any unusual or even damning objects that may have been found in her apartment. I outlined my relationship with her and told them we'd broken up amicably a couple of months before. Yes, I'd been to her apartment a couple of times. Nothing unusual about it, and I'd never met her neighbors. Then the detectives revealed to me something I'd never known. Fiona had been questioned in the disappearances of 2 of her past ex-boyfriends, in 2004 and 2009, Austin, Texas, and Rochester, New York. No charges had ever been filed. Birth records indicated she had an older sister who'd vanished in 1980 from a foster home in Robinsong, Virginia. She'd been a little strange, I admitted, and liked to think of herself as a practitioner of this or that unusual fringe theology. It had all been Greek to me, muddled and unimportant to our brief time together. The detectives never interrupted me, maybe trying to let me reveal too much, and I sensed I was not being given the full picture of what they knew. The female Pat looked at me very closely throughout, and was quick to clarify things I'd been vague about. It began to feel quite intentional on her part. Eventually they thanked me and left. I sat for a time on my couch, flipping through the channels on TV, not really seeing any of them, haunted by the thought that Fiona may have kept a diary, and that my fingerprints were on that zipper bag I'd found back in her bathtub. When my hands felt steady again and I'd had 2 cups of strong coffee, I decided to busy myself by finally going through the mountain of mail that had accumulated during my convalescence in Falmouth. I'd only gotten as far as dumping it all into a plastic tote. Bills, ads, invitations, 2 small packages from Amazon. and one letter addressed to me, yet having misspelled my last name. The sender had hand-printed a return address. Greta Fair, Starfish Farm, 1014 Trapper Road, Reynoldsville, Illinois. The letter was postmarked October 10th, 2 days before someone had entered Fiona's apartment and apparently attempted to kill her.
Robert, if you're reading this, you haven't run. I'm asking you one more time to go. Probably the only reason you're still alive is that she sees the end of her path so close ahead that she thinks you're beneath her violence. Everything she ever told you about herself may have been true once, but not for a long time. She broke from us, the people who understood her. We are peaceful, but her intent is not. All things are bending and merging for her now. The far spider has shown her favor. It embraces her rage and is rewarding her for it. It's begun to create conditions for her that she can't create herself. The burial was of her own design, and the windstorm was random. But I don't believe the storm over the Sound was, and the next thing won't be either. I have loved her, but it can't be allowed. I tell you this to prepare you for what I have to do. I have sent our sisters away to safety, and I have gone to stop her. If she does survive at all, and is granted transformation for her wagers, leave nothing of your body for her to find. There is even more inside it that she can swallow and feed from.
Reynoldsville was 40 miles south, in the same general direction as the place where Fiona had confronted and defeated the cold earth under the impenetrable terms she'd entered into with some entity I didn't know or understand. It was a little before 5 p.m. when the GPS told me I was approaching 1014 Trapper Road. The last 8 miles or so of the trip, leading me a stone's throw from the Mississippi River, had been an alternating pattern of woods and farms stretched along decaying country tarmac, and I expected the address to be one of those farmhouses, high on a hill maybe, far away from everything. But then for a full mile, the surroundings got even more dense with woods, no houses at all on either side. Finally, I seemed to reach my destination, which was nothing more than a tiny square indentation on which sat a single-story structure that didn't look much like a house at all. I pulled the car into a patch of grass beside it. There was a freestanding brown sign in front of this brick, virtually windowless enclosure. A sign showing great age and even a few old, unenthused loops of yellow graffiti. This place was described in a few lines of cold block text as a water analysis station, now long shuttered. Swearing, I checked the address again, 1014 Trapper Road. The numbers were almost comically prominent on the building. A wide, unmarked gravel road led back into the woods. I idled where I was for a minute, trying to make sense of the facts I'd been presented. And then I noticed the small green Department of Water Resources logo in the bottom right-hand corner of the old brown sign. That logo was a starfish. I decided to head down that gravel road. It was scarred with unrepaired potholes, half filled with rainwater, and I drove all over the place to avoid them. The county seemed to have abandoned all pretense of maintaining this lonesome stretch of nothingness. Despite the autumn chill, I was sweating lightly, and an unusually constant din of sirens miles away, a chorus that had begun 10 minutes before but had never gotten any closer, made me extremely tense. Eventually the road opened up into an area of small hills and fields left to grow wild and die. Then up ahead there was a small sign with a symbol on it indicating the road was ending, which it did, simply petering out into an area of ragged grass as if the county had given up mid-construction. I shut off the engine and got out. I walked past the sign and made my way up a gentle rise, hoping to get a slightly better view of the area. About 100 yards away from the top of the incline, there was what appeared to be a farm, inaccessible by any real road. The way towards it consisted of nothing more than a path in the grass, beaten down by the occasional vehicle. I left my car where it was and walked, still limping. I counted 9 small structures total, 2 tiny barns, 1 long, low building that might have housed animals, and 5 roughly identical shacks with windows cut into them. There was also what I figured to be an outhouse. No one seemed to be here. There wasn't a single car in sight. But there were 2 clotheslines with garments hanging on each. Undeniably a sign of life. There was not a sound, though. None of the shacks quite matched in their design, as if instead of being built at the same time, one had begat another, and then another, and then another. There was a big fenced pen among them, but no livestock inside it. I saw a very large garden that still showed signs of producing beets, lettuce, and broccoli. And beyond that, 2 fields that had been planted with potatoes but were now suffering. I stood and listened for a moment, waiting. And then I flinched and almost yelped as a loud alarm suddenly went off in my coat pocket. I tore my phone out of it to silence it with shaking hands. It had erupted in some kind of weather warning or maybe a missing child alert, as it did once every 6 months or so out of the blue. I didn't even look at it. Those alarms had never affected me. They'd only woken me, terrified from a deep sleep, or shattered my concentration in the office. I shut the phone off instead and settled myself, breathing deeply. I moved to the shack closest to me and pulled on the rickety door. It was unlocked. Inside was a tiny domicile that seemed to have no source of electricity. The thin bed had had its sheets and blankets removed. There was a small table, a dresser, flowers and vases still looking relatively healthy. It was much the same story in 2 other shacks. I guessed that someone had been living in them quite recently. They were not very dusty. There was no sense of mold. In the second shack, some books had been left behind. Textbooks, mostly. Botany, oceanography, also some poetry. I walked over to that long, low building and went inside. It was nothing but a large, empty room with neatly laid wooden planks for a floor, a sort of gathering hall. The acoustics in here would have been very poor, but then I thought I had heard a sampling of them on a cassette tape not so long ago. About 2 dozen folding chairs were leaning against one another in one corner. God help me. The first mental connection I made as I stood there was to a photo I'd once seen of the room where Reverend Jim Jones had urged his followers to drink poison. I detected a smell when I emerged from that building. An unpleasant smell. It got stronger as I moved toward the shack that was closest to the woods, which were about 30 yards away to the west. A sweet but sickly smell. Call the police right now, I said to myself, and leave this place. The gray sky was starting to lose its light fast, but I was so close. I was so close. I approached and opened the door. Inside the shack, 2 candles had burned out. They sat atop a bookcase with nothing in it but a few articles of clothing. The occupant possessed a small desk and chair like the others, and a bed bigger than theirs. Greta Fair lay on top of this one, face up. The covers beneath her were in disarray. She was wearing faded jeans and a rust-colored sweater. Her feet were bare, her toenails unusually long. Her arms and legs were outstretched. Protruding from the exact center point of her chest was the golden handle and a full 24 inches of the rusty antique sword I'd seen in Fiona's apartment. Greta had been run through with almost surgical tidiness. Someone had placed some sort of large object beneath the small of her back so that her midsection was crudely arched. As I moved gently toward her, I bent at the waist to see what it was. The sword had plunged not only through Greta, but through an adult gray hog, and then onward into the blood-stained mattress. The hog's eyes were closed forever. Greta's were open and bulging. The skin on her face had already begun to pull tight against her skull. Blotches of some kind of dark substance had been streaked onto her cheeks. There was more of it on the handle of the sword, just like I had seen before. I stepped out into the light of dusk. I looked to the east, where the once featureless sky had become muddied with unusual patches of color, even in the absence of the sun. It looked like a thundercloud had settled just over a faraway part of the forest. But it wasn't a cloud. It was a mass of smoke, breaking apart in wisps and funnels. I returned to the car, not looking behind me, not taking my eyes off the horizon. The sound of sirens I'd heard on the ride to Starfish Farm had returned twofold by the time I got behind the wheel. It turned out I wouldn't really need the cell phone alert to tell me what was happening and what the source of the danger in the area was. Only about 5 miles back down Trapper Road did that become obvious, from the grim discoloration in the sky, and ever so faint glimpses of points of light through the trees where there should have been none. I drove almost aimlessly for a time, not truly understanding where I was, taking wooded country roads in the general direction of Mill Creek. 10 minutes after leaving the farm, I started to see isolated but recognizable patches of flame through the darkness. I rolled down my window and I could just hear it. The sound of fires in the distance. I could hear crackling and rumbling, even over the car engine and the wind. I turned onto something called Cork Run. It took me down a gloomy straightaway where I saw, far away, the trunks of trees burning for the first time, and a steady orange glow seeping through the foliage. The entirety of the sky ahead of me was slowly turning red. I slowed the car down to 15 miles per hour and drove right down the center of the road, hugging the yellow line to keep far away from the chaos that was emerging on either side of me. 1 more mile, and I was truly inside the outskirts of the central blaze. Smoke formed a canopy overhead, and a million yellow eyes seethed in the underbrush. It was impossible to tell the time of day because the sky had gone the color of blood. The road twisted and wound deeper into the forest, where the fires were growing and growing. A phenomenon statistically less likely to strike Illinois than any state in the country. Around a long, jagged bend, trees along the shoulder were on fire from trunk to crown. I felt as if I were traveling through a painting of a disaster, protected inside my expensive car. I kept the windows rolled up and turned off the vents. The road kept going, and drawn by a certainty that the story was ending here, I followed it. I could feel the heat and figured I could only tolerate another mile or so before it became unendurable. Branches began to fall, sometimes onto the edge of the road, so I had to pay close attention to my path. 1 more slight bend and everything got much worse. I saw a big gout of flame off to my right, and the volume of the conflagration rose. The road itself blackened under the weight of that stew of hot colors around me. Here the fires had begun to truly rage, and now sparks and small flumes were shooting up and outward over the road. I stopped where I was, scared to go farther, but transfixed by what I was seeing. Like the sinister attraction of Fiona, this was something I knew I would never experience again. Sights and sounds, both exotic and supernatural, and I felt myself savoring this last taste of true danger before the life ahead of me, which I knew would have none of it. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw that the way behind me remained clear, but probably not for much longer. I looked down just long enough to put the car into reverse. When I raised my head again, Fiona was in the passenger seat. She had never looked like this before, never. Her straight blonde hair flowed over a dress of pure white, a color she had never worn in our time together. She was holding flowers in her lap, carnations. Her makeup had been applied with the kind of perfection she'd always scorned in others. The firelight threw shifting shadows across her face, that beautiful face, which now looked 20 years younger. "This is not me," she whispered. "That's me, up ahead. Go see how close I came. Are you proud of me, darling?" She turned her head slowly, almost robotically, to look through the windshield. I looked there too, seeing nothing but the darkening road and the abstract chaos of the forest fire. And then the seat beside me was empty again, the vision gone. I got out of the car, leaving it running. I began to sweat freely, and breathing quickly became difficult. I walked forward, feeling uncomfortable heat on the bottoms of my shoes. The noise of the fire was great enough now to drown out my footsteps. Somewhere off to my left I heard a tree fall, and simultaneously a deep, hollow burst as a tongue of flame arose from a thicket. The shapes of the trees around me were becoming less and less distinct as the glow all around warped their visual integrity. Up ahead, there was a moving vertical shaft of firelight, emerging slowly between two trees onto the shoulder of the road. Fiona, reckless wagerer, lonely murderer, stepped out onto the road. She was entirely engulfed in flame. Only for a brief moment could I discern that she was wearing a long dress, blackened and dissolving fast. She walked gracefully, as if she were walking towards me again at midnight along the shore of Kincaid Lake. There was nothing in her face that was recognizable as human. The flames ate every part of her as she came forward, arms low to her sides, walking up the center of the road. I remember her standing in front of me, and me peering into that awful, silent mess of bone and ash, all her flesh gone. Her lower jaw fell open, but she could say nothing to me now. I glimpsed the bottom row of her teeth, shining white-hot embers caught between some of them, delineating them in a terrible way. She remained upright for as long as she could, and then, as I heard another tree split and fall, she fell too at my feet, barely making a sound. Half her body weight had vanished into the air, leaving nothing but a loose pile of remains that burned more slowly now that death had come. Fiona had lost her final bet, tricked perhaps by the uncaring forces she had made her pact with. She came so close, but her only transformation in the end was that of a tortured soul turned to one at rest. A lifeless heart I have, out of pity and nostalgia for an unwise love affair now 21 years gone, secretly preserved inside my beating one.
Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Matthew Arnold.